and also to have a little bit of a look back, because you have been fighting this fight for quite a while, and I think it's very interesting. As a, I would say, younger feminist, always to remember that we are kind of like standing on the shoulders of generations before us, and to look back what we can learn from fights that have come before us. And so I would just start right away and ask you, in the 70s, you started the campaign wages for reproductive work, for wages for care work. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what was the idea behind the campaign, what was the strategy, how you got the idea.
Yes, so thank you, and greetings to all the people who are listening to us. The idea of wages for housework, came out of an analysis of the position of women in our society. What are the causes, the root causes of the discrimination that women have suffered, and at the time in which the women's movement was looking for strategies and was looking for not only mobilization in the street, but something that could really provide a long-term strategy, a long-term program. For us, the decision to focus on a strategy of wages for housework, that for us was not just a demand, but it was a strategy. Came from for different reasons. An important one was to show that what we call housework, domestic work, it's really work. Because it may seem strange now, but actually it was very, very difficult to even have it recognized. And in fact, it was always treated as something, natural to women. And secondly, it was a way of protesting and refusing the kind of devaluation that has been typical in our society. So work in our society has been production, for the market, production of commodities, has been associated with the factory, with the offices, with wage work. The work that women have done in the house and outside of the house has always been considered, right, as something, again, that pertains, that is not really real work. And associated to that has been a constant devaluation, lack of recognition. As we always said, for example, women, not only this work is not waged, this work is not paid, women have no vacation, right? Women have been full-time housewives, they never retire, and none of the benefits that have been associated with wage labor. So it's very clear there's been a steady devaluation of this work. And the idea of fighting for wages for housework was very, very important. Was because we saw this devaluation as something that went even beyond the home and the family and the work that women have done. It was a devaluation of human life, because when you devalue the activities, that are, involved, in the reproduction of human life, then you really devalue, life itself. So we thought that, putting a price to this work, was a provocative but necessary step, right? And also, third, very important, to give women a choice of whether they also wanted to work outside the home or not, particularly in the presence of young children, many women who prefer not to have another job. And always to have two jobs in order to be able to have some autonomy, not to depend on a man. We knew that many women stayed with men they didn't care for, even violent men, because they had not an alternative, or because they had young children and they could not afford to leave. So for us, it was very, very important. Also, and not last, in the United States, when we were demanding wages for housework, there was already a movement of women. It was called the movement of welfare mothers, who had been able to obtain from the state, a subsidies because they had no husband and they had young children. The program was called Aid to Family with Dependent Children, and the government was threatening to cut it. And as they did, with disastrous consequences for many, many, many women. So for us also, to demand wages for housework was to give support to that struggle, and was to say welfare should not be seen as a charity. This is work that supports the whole of society. This is work that is actually extremely fundamental. It's the pillar of every other activity. So this was the broad, the range of reasons that supported the strategies.
What you just said, it's kind of a pillar for everything else happening in society. I think when we talk as a society about economy, we often just think about wage labor. We think about, like, in a more traditional way, people going to the factory. Nowadays, maybe also people going to the startup and doing their work there. What do you think, what consequences does the separation of the economy and the household and what's happening there have on us?
Oh, I think it's a big consequence. As I said, the first thing is devaluing, a whole area of life, and I think here there's also history, going back into history, as I've done in my work, Caliban and the Witch, reconstructing what takes place, in the transition to a capitalist society, and to see that with the formation of a capitalist economic system, when you have now production, it's geared towards the market, you begin to have a separation that didn't exist before between production and reproduction, and in that process, the reproduction of human life became completely invisible. And I just give you an example. One example that was very striking, for us to discover that, in our society, production for the war, for example, work that produces armaments, is considered as contributing to the social wealth. The work that goes into raising the new generation, into reproducing our life in every way, is not considered as contributing to the wealth of society. I think that says it all about the logic that governs our society. So in a way, our demand was not just a strict, narrow union demand, right? A bit of work for a bit of money for this work. It was really subverting, within it, there was the subversion of the logic that governs our society, and to place the value of life first, to place the fact that the work that is fundamental, what could be more fundamental? The raising children, taking care, for example, of people who are not completely self-sufficient, doing all the daily activity that create our life, including emotional activity, because housework, domestic work, is not only material work, it's also emotional work. It's also making sure that all the crises in interpersonal relations are resolved. So for us, it was a statement about the direction in which the society must move. It was not only about housework itself, but it was a broader statement about what kind of value. And today, in many parts of Latin America, for instance, but also in Spain, women speak of placing life at the center. That when all is said and done, at the center, at the bottom of feminist organizing and struggling is the idea of placing life at the center. Well, this was also the idea of wages for housework.
Thank you. I think one question I always have in my mind when you say like wages of housework kind of try to subvert how we distribute work, how we separate reproductive and productive work. But was there also a fear? Because I always think there's one conservative party, a Christian conservative party here in Germany. They also like want more money for women that stay at home to like look after the housework, to look after the children. Was there also debate going on if there's also like a risk of if you do like if you get wages for housework, but the distribution stays the same on a basic level, it could also pressure the women more into the private space, keep them out of the public space more?
Yeah, this was, this was, of course, a constant comment that we received, that this would institutionalize. But we found that when we organize among women, particularly among working class women, they would say, we are already institutionalized in the home. We don't have the money to take a bus to go into town. We don't have the time of women who have 2 jobs. We are already institutionalized in the home and in the factory. In other words, the idea that having some money of their own will not represent for women a possibility of choice, and will not also be a venue to desexualize this work, because what we found is that very often, even in families, where the husband was willing to share the housework, could we share the housework, very often it did not happen, because if he went out to have a job, he would earn a higher income. Whereas if she worked outside the home and in the presence of young children, somebody had to stay home. So she would stay home. And so we saw, for instance, that every employer knows that women are used to work for free. And, women receive low wages when they go work outside the home. And they very, very, very often, the majority, end up doing work that is a continuation of housework. It's not, there's only a minority, relatively speaking. This is true into the present. For instance, we found now, we have been doing work in the United States, and now we're discovering it's true in Latin America as well, that women who have a wage job, right, their wages are so low that very soon they fall into debt. In the United States, what has been happening is that with the more massive entrance of women into the waged workforce, a whole new set of companies, they call themselves payday loan. Payday loan is companies who give women on the payday a loan. So what is happening? Women are not earning enough now to be able to support themselves or their children with what they earn. So they receive the wage, and the wage becomes the avenue to a loan. So they work, but they are not capable of becoming autonomous. And they fall more and more into that, right? So we see now that our misgivings in the 70s were well placed. That what we predicted, the women would become enslaved, even because they would not either be able to leave their husband, or if they took a job outside the home, right, they'll be working all their life and hardly making it. And this is what is happening, that only a minority, a relatively small minority worldwide, is able to have some real autonomy by working outside the home. The majority, the work that they're doing is drudgery and is not at all capable of giving them. And I think there is a connection. There is a very powerful connection with the fact that the question of reproduction has not been solved. It has changed. The problematic has changed, but it has not been solved.
That would have actually been my next question, because I think that is something we see today when I think you would ask many younger women, even though it has changed in Germany, especially I think in the last year, also throughout the coronavirus, many would say, well, it's much better than it was before. And many things have changed, I think, because there is more women going into wage labor. The wages have been gone up a little bit. But what you just said, we see that there's a lot of women working in care jobs, working in essential jobs for low wages with a lot of pressure. Women still in total earn so much less. And I think my question would be, what can we learn if you say, well, the questions you posed throughout the 70s, they are still relevant today. What about the strategies? There's one strategy that's being discussed, I think, on a global level, is the strike strategy, like women's strikes. Would that be a strategy you think is useful?
Well, let me get first the change, because I think it's very important to see the change. And I insist that the change has actually confirmed, all our, the reason why we refuse to say that the strategy for women's liberation is going out and getting a wage job. And we always said, unless we deal with the question of reproduction, going out to the home and taking a wage job will not be the solution. And in fact, something very interesting is happening that we cannot forget. I mean, I cannot speak for Germany because I don't know the data for Germany, but I know for other parts of Europe and for the United States. The moment that women, moved in a great number, with the late 70s, early 80s, they really enter in mass, the wage workforce. What you have simultaneously, almost automatically, every state begins to cut the investment in social services, catering to reproduction. That's what neoliberalism has been about. In the United States, there's been a continuous reduction of investment in services for the elderly, for daycare. Today, if you want to send your children to daycare, it's very, very, very difficult to be able to sustain it, for the majority of women. What is happening now, the many women get together in the community and they take care of the children of one another, when some are going out to have a wage job. But otherwise, we don't have services. The services for the senior centers have been cut. This is very important. So what has happened is that, in fact, most women have gone out of the home, and the result has been either a total reduction in reproduction, which has impacted the life, particularly of children and the elderly, but also the life of everybody. The increase of obesity in the United States. We have a country where the majority, not the majority, but a large amount of people are literally obese. And this is in the working class, and this is connected to the use of fast food. There is no time for cooking. Nobody, men, women, there is no time for really taking care of the most important needs. So now we have been an increase, a terrible increase of medical problems, beginning with obesity. More well-to-do women who have a certain level of income when they go out to work, they now hire nannies. You go to the parks in New York every day and you see Black women coming from the Caribbean, coming from Africa, or Filipino women, and this is true. I know for Italy, for instance, I come originally from Italy, I go often there, and I see, the badanti, the elderly are taken care by women who are coming from Asia, from Eastern Europe. So their work is being done, and it's pitting women against each other. Because often you have women who are not earning that much and then have used their money, and then you have women who have to send money back home in the Philippines or in Africa or in the Caribbean islands. And yet their wages are terrible. They have all the problems of migration. Their work is undervalued. So actually, the situation has demonstrated that reproductive work is still a place of crisis, and that working outside the home, has not solved at all or emancipated. And I mentioned before that, yes, many women now have jobs outside the home, but they also have huge amount of debts. We have a whole generation of women who have now, in Latin America now, Ni Una Menos, the movement, the struggle against violence against women, has changed their slogan. Before was Vivas las queremos, we want them alive. Now they say vivas y desendeudadas, alive and without debts. We want them alive, but without debts. And so the issue is still very, very open. And I think that COVID has put the spotlight on it, because COVID has not created the crisis, but has exploded it. It has really exploded. The crisis was there. We saw it every day. Women juggling, working outside the home, coming home, and then having to work 11 o'clock at night. Many of them don't have an husband to share. Today, more men are doing some housework, but many families have also broken apart because of the economic crisis and for other reasons. So you have an increase of single mothers, women living alone, men living alone. So we say, oh, share with the man. Well, share with the man if the man is there, right? And true, younger men now are much more available to share the housework. The generation of my father for sure, right? But at the same time, it does not resolve the problem. Yeah. Because it also means a tremendous amount of tension for everybody. I'm all for sharing the housework when a man is present in the house. But the solution is really a societal change and a rechanneling of resources. Of course, we are all in favor of moving resources from the apparatuses of repression, war, police, and so on, and moving it at the support of life.
I think that's something really interesting you said, because it's an experience I have a lot in my generation. There's couples and they are like both convinced, like if it's heterosexual couples, they're both convinced we want to share the housework, we want to share it. And there's young men being conscious about it and also wanting to share the burden. But I think the problem is, especially from the moment on that kids enter the relationship, there's also the question of money. And I think as long as it's going to be rational, on an economical level, rational for most couples, not all the couples, and also in couples where they earn the same, it's not perfect, but as long as it's going to be rational for couples that for them to not share the housework, but for the women to do it on their own. So as long as the men earn more, as long as the men work in other jobs as the women, I don't think we're going to get to a fair distribution. It's not just about values. It's not just about roles. It's also about what the resources are in the end for many people.
Very right. You're very right. And one important issue, very, 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 very important. And this is also the reduction of work time. But today we have really a scandalous situation because we have a huge amount of unemployment. And again, I speak particularly, and at the same time, the people who have a job are working more than ever. You look at the subway, people are coming home at 10 o'clock at night. More and more. Now with the COVID, all kinds of things have changed. But the work week has become a work week that is comparable to the Industrial Revolution, the period, the 8 hours. It's much longer. So we need to have also a reduction of work time. Otherwise, it's not impossible for men or for women to actually care for the community, care for their family, care for their friends, care for the community.
You said before that all the questions you posed in the 70s, they are it's not like they are proven wrong, but in the other way, you think they have been proven right. I would imagine in some ways that's reassuring, but I would imagine in other ways it's also probably a little frustrating because the fight has been going on for so long. So I think my last question, because unfortunately, I think there would be so much more to talk, but we are like nearing the end of the talk. I think my last question would be, what gives you hope?
My hope actually is that we are seeing now a generation of feminists, and I'm speaking now very internationally. I think there's a generation of feminists who is becoming much more aware than perhaps we were in the 70s, that you cannot have a change in the condition of women unless you really have much more of a change in the general material conditions of life. And that, for example, like the restructuring of work, of the workplace, and the rechanneling of resources, and also the need for women to have control, over, for example, the services provided by the state. I think we are discovering we are not happy, for example, with the kind of healthcare or childcare. We want to have a say also. I think it's very important. The question of cooperation with women, for instance, or men while working within the institution. I think that the awareness of the need to change the material condition is very, very crucial. And there is a sort of general agreement on the number one issue is really we say the appropriation of resources. I like that even more than redistribution, because this is all wealth that we have produced. And but rechanneling from destructive activities that now are consuming so much of the world wealth. So much is going into war, an instrument of repression, and in the destruction of the environment. So, and we haven't even had time to talk about the destruction of the environment. That too is reproductive work, the decay of the environment. And I think, feminism with ecofeminism has really expanded the notion of what is reproduction. And so for us now there is a broader consciousness, I think, in the new women's movement about what is necessary to really implement a strong, broad structural change.
I think it's also really interesting when you look at the young climate movement, it's young women being in the front row. It's young women not longer accepting other people deciding over their bodies, deciding over their future, deciding over their lives. And for me, that's also something that gives me a lot of hope.
And
Thank you very much.
And let me say one more thing, yes, which is the continuity of the struggle, the continuity for different kinds. We see, for instance, that the disaster caused by COVID has very much to do with the collapse of the sanitary system, the collapse of the provision, for example, that the state at all levels had in place to give security to people's lives, but also the environment, the collapse of the immunity that we have. COVID has fed on the fact that many people's lungs are destroyed by the poor quality of the air. People's immunity system destroyed by the poison in our food, in the soil, in agriculture. And then all the crises within the family. The fact that there is no time for reproduction, no time to spend together, etc. And so the change that is needed is a very, very broad change. And I think the feminist movement, in many ways, is the one who has the broader understanding of the change that is needed, together with the movement against racism and against, all kinds of inequality.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Thank you for being here, sharing. And like you said, it's a continuing struggle. And I think we can learn very much when we look back and see what questions are still posed today and what are our visions for the future. And therefore, I'm very glad you were here with us today.
Thank you, and the best.
Bye.
conference. Bye.